Chapter 15. Never interrogate a Turk. Have the children all been assembled, Albus? Cornelius Fudge stood in front of Albus Dumbledore's desk, his lime green bowler resting in his open palm. Dolores had sent word to him that several of the students were undergoing radical physical and mental changes, and it was possibly due to some meddling by Albus himself. There had also been reports of 3 males that appeared in the village about the time the boys started to change. They hadn't been trying to hide themselves from what the villagers were saying, yet when the ministry had shown up that morning they hadn't sight hide nor tail of any of the 3 men. Albus nodded, his eyes twinkling behind his half-moon spectacles, though he wasn't exactly happy. He knew these boys weren't going to give up information easily, and that could go badly for them. While he was the only one that could expel a student, the ministry could make the poor kid's life a living hell from here on out. Well, then we shall start the investigation. Cornelius motioned to the 2 errors that Dumbledore didn't recognize. They must have been new, which he didn't like. New errors tended to be spell-happy, and if they were with Umbridge and Fudge, that didn't bode well at all for his students. Because these children are under the age, their heads of houses will be in the room with them. Fudge stopped and turned back, seeing the dark look in Dumbledore's eyes. Of course. Of course. If nothing else, that would ensure that if they tried to overstep their bounds, he knew Minerva and Severus and Phileas would not hesitate to step in. The group made their way into the Dada classroom where the students were being held. They were going to be using Dolores' office for the interviews. Entering the classroom, the group were all startled with exactly how silent the room was. The group were all sitting or standing around the room. Harry, who was now almost completely silver-haired, was standing up against the wall, arms crossed over his chest and legs lazily crossed with his head down and eyes closed. Neville stood next to him in a similar position, but his now glowing blue eyes were watching them warily. Fred was next to him doing squats of all things, but the normally hyperactive Weasley twin was completely silent. Draco and Blaise were currently sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by Ginny, Luna, George, and Dean. Draco was laying across the desk, lazily rolling a glowing orb across the desk, occasionally shooting Blaise a look before going back to it. Minerva, Severus and Flitwick were already there, and they were watching the children with stony faces. The sheer calmness in the room was unnerving, especially with the 2 Weasleys who for the first time were nowhere near each other. Hearing people entering the room, the group looked up. 3 pairs of glowing eyes and several pairs of normal eyes locked on them before turning away, going back to what they were doing prior. Umbridge was looking at the boys, that sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face, her eyes watching them like they were pieces of meat up for slaughter. "May I have your attention, please?" One of the errors moved into the room, instantly feeling unnerved seeing those cold eyes regarding him. "It has come to the ministry's attention that you children have possibly been tampered with by a dark wizard." He watched as George Weasley actually rolled his eyes before reaching into his robe and withdrawing a mull cigarette and lighting it up. "I swear to Gaia they are all brain dead, you," he said, shaking his head. "Mr. Weasley, you will put that out right now," Minerva said, seeing that one of her students had gotten into that filthy habit. George actually glared at her before flipping her off and went right back to smoking. "Mr. Weasley, you will put that out." Severus made a move towards the boy but stopped, seeing several of the middle group had stood up to intercept him. They didn't have wands drawn, as they had their wands confiscated from them upon entering the room, but their body language was easily hostile. Clearing his throat, the Auror looked back to Umbridge. Jiggling, she flicked her wand, causing the cig to vanish. George stood, his now aquamarine eyes flashing in pure anger. "What the fuck, you? You goddamn fat toad, bring it back." Reno. Blaise had been the one to speak. His now steel-colored eyes were regarding George with a strange light. Blaise started talking in another language that not even Albus recognized. It sounded like Japanese, but the dialect was off and half the words weren't making any sense together. George though seemed to understand it perfectly as he nodded and sat back down. Clearing his throat once more, the returned back to the group. We're going to be interviewing you each one at a time and running a series of cruise spells to make sure this isn't dark magic that is causing you all to change. Mr. Zabini, we would like to speak to you first. He had been the one reported to show the first signs of change and was the most advanced of them, although Neville was a walking behemoth. Blaze stood with an elegance of someone that was even more well-bred than his family was supposed to be. Severus moved up the stairs after his student. While Blaze had never been one of his favorites since he held such extreme arrogance, he was not about to let any of his house fall to these new eras. Walking up the stairs, Tseng pulled on his Turk mask, every emotion completely blanking out, leaving him an emotionless boy. Moving into the room really tested that mask, as he was nearly blinded by the horrid shades of pinks that covered almost every spare inch of the office, and those horrid plate with meowing kittens. New thought for the interrogation room: no sane man will ever survive long in a room like this. Might just make my job a little easier. Please have a seat, Mr. Zabini. Umbridge moved to sit behind her desk, that ugly smile plastered on her face. Moving over to the desk, Tseng sat down gracefully. He folded a leg over his other knee and gently folded his hands in his lap. He looked as cool as a cucumber as he sat there. Here, have some tea. Umbridge slid a horribly gaudy pink and white teacup towards him across her desk. If he wasn't a Turk already, that would have been enough to send up red flags. Tea already poured and ready for him. Nope, something was put into it, more than likely a truth serum of some sort. Being a Turk though, he knew better than to take anything given to him. No thank you, tea does not sit well with me. He gently pushed the cup back, his steel-colored eyes completely emotionless, though inside he was laughing like hell at the look that crossed her face. So he was right. They had slipped something into the tea. He would need to make sure to convey that to the soldiers before they were interviewed. The puppy might just take the tea, and he didn't know if the Mako in his body would be enough to battle the truth serum. Sephiroth and Angel no problem because of the Genova cells, but Zack didn't have the extreme amount the two boys did. But I insist, darling. Umbridge tried once more, pushing the tea back. This time Tseng remained completely silent, his hands once more folded gently in his lap. Mr. Zabini, I am going to run a few spells over you to test to see if there are any curses or dark magic on you. Tseng nodded and went back to staring straight out in front of him. Deae moved over and waved his wand under the careful eyes of Severus. After a few minutes, Deae returned back to Umbridge, shaking his head. Nothing. He moved so that he was leaning up against the desk watching the young boy. Most teenagers were easy to intimidate, so he would spill pretty quickly. There have been reports of 3 strange men floating around Hogsmeade. Know anything about these 3 men? Those steel eyes moved so that they were looking at him. There was no emotions in them at all, they were perfectly blank. I fail to see how I would possibly know of 3 strange men in Hogsmeade when we have yet to have a Hogsmeade weekend. Tseng kept his eyes locked with Deae, knowing that on its own tended to unnerve them faster than anything. Genesis Rhapsodos, does that name mean anything to you? No. Deae frowned, pulling out a list of questions they were supposed to ask. Can you explain why your skin had lightened to this extent? I can only assume it's vitiligo. That is the only logical explanation that I can devise, but I'm no doctor. Tseng tilted his head slightly before turning his attention to Umbridge, seeing that her smile was looking more and more forced by the minute. Before this year you have never hung around Draco Malfoy or Harry Potter. What is the reason behind that, Mr. Zabini? Tseng turned back to Deae, giving him his attention once more. Does someone require a reason to find someone's company enjoyable? I do not see how this pertains to the claims that we have been cursed and manipulated. You have run tests and found no evidence of dark magic. Tseng tilted his head to the side slightly, still keeping his face completely emotionless, but he was having a hell of a time not laughing at Umbridge's face. These were not the answers she was wanting, but with Severus standing there they couldn't do anything about it. "Thank you, Mr. Zarbini, that is all." Nodding slightly, Tseng stood and walked out of the room, never once glancing back. Reaching the group, he caught Sephiroth's eye, instantly relaying the message about the tea. Seeing that they were possibly being tampered with, Sephiroth turned away and kept his voice low enough only his soldiers would hear. "Do not take anything offered to you, they are lacing it with a substance more than likely a truth serum." Angel and Zack both nodded. They both knew better, but it was nice to know that Umbridge was trying to play dirty. "George Weasley, you are next." "About fucking time you." Standing up, he slunk off after the ministry official. Those left behind started to snicker hard. Reno was one of the, if not the worst, to interrogate. While Tseng remained calm and unflappable, Reno would guss worse than Sid Highwind. Moving into the room, Reno whistled low, pulling a face. "This is a damn ugly room, you. Looks like Pepto puked all over the walls." Moving over to the chair, he threw himself into it and set his feet up on the desk. "All right, let's get this over, wish you." Minerva watched her student, wondering what had happened to him. This was so beyond his normal behavior. Vera nodded and did the same spells, coming up with the same results. "Mr. Weasley, do you know anything about 3 strange men wandering around Hogsmeade?" Reno laid his head back, looking at the error, and scoffed. "Got to narrow it down a fuckload more than that, you. Every fucking wizard in Hogsmeade is fucking strange, you." Vera blinked at this and tried to regather his thoughts. 3 men that have only been here since the start of term. Reno snorted at this, rolling his eyes. "How in Gaia's name am I supposed to know who's new in Hogsmeade? I'm sorry, divination is not my forte." He shook his head, slinking further down into his chair, throwing his arms behind his head and looking completely content with what was going on. "How about a Genesis Rhapsodos? PHHTT. What kind of fucking name is that, you? Man, and I thought y'all had some weird ones before. This one takes the cake." Oh, Genesis was going to chase his ass all around Hogwarts, shooting fireballs at him for this one. What about this sudden change in attitude and appearance? Ever think people change, numbnuts? What kind of bullshit question is that, you? I thought Raz was supposed to be smart, yo. You all as dense as a sack of bricks in a black hole. His accent had started to become thicker as he talked, instinctively slipping back into the slum slang. "Thank you, Mr. Weasley. Can you send in Dean Thomas?" "Yeah, whatever, you." Reno pushed himself up and out of the door, calling out for Dean. A moment later, the big dark-skinned boy moved in and sat down quietly. Rude was absolutely infuriating. He didn't talk, and when he answered the question it was simply no. The rest of the Turks and Draco were almost just as bad. Elena started going off about creatures that only certain wizards could see. Cisnai just dead set refused to say anything, and Draco would simply laugh behind his hand and call them all a bunch of Palmer wannabes. Harry was the next to be called up. Not looking at any of them, he sat down gracefully into the chair. "Professor." He inclined his head towards McGonagall. He wasn't going to be mean to her, but he wasn't going to be nice to these people at all. "Tea, Mr. Potter?" "No." Umbridge's smile faltered some, as every one of the children so far had refused the tea, even the tea-loving Ginny. "Now, Mr. Potter, we know for a fact that you do know a Genesis Rhapsodos. Several pictures reported you not only with the man in the castle but threatening Dumbledore if someone touched him. If you would be so kind as to tell us who he is." Sephiroth looked up at the Auror but remained completely tight-lipped. He didn't tell anyone anything, not even his name, rank and serial number. Turks could lie through their teeth, so they were allowed to give shoddy answers. Soldiers were not taught to lie like a Turk, so they were supposed to remain completely silent except their name, rank and serial number. "Come now, Mr. Potter, is you possibly being expelled worth all this? All we want to know is who this man is." Still Sephiroth remained tight-lipped. He actually wasn't even paying attention anymore. He had gone off into his own little world. This was going to be a very, very long day. 2 hours later they allowed him to go. It would seem Sephiroth's ability to ignore them was a lot stronger than they originally thought. The boy had not uttered a single word the entire time. Hell, it looked like he had actually fallen asleep at one point during the questioning. Neville and Zack were the exact same, neither said a word, and they wouldn't not even extreme torture as they were trained not to talk under any circumstance. To say that the Ministry was frustrated beyond all reason would have been a gross understatement. Fudge was livid by this point, and so was Umbridge. Umbridge more than likely because she wasn't able to break out the thumb screws and interrogate them properly. Nothing? Absolutely nothing? Fudge growled as they made their way back down through the castle. No sir, Mr. Potter remained completely tight-lipped even on questions about Cedric and you-know-who. Sighing, the old man walked out the front gates, putting his bowler back on. Take the picture we have of him and make up a new story about the boy's growing insanity. Have it published by tomorrow in the Prophet.
Well, I do hope you enjoyed the videos so far and video game content. And don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment down below. And I noticed 40% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel. If you can, please subscribe to the channel. It'll help me and help the channel grow. Until next time, goodbye!